Hey, welcome. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to bake textures in XNormals for those of you that don't have access to a computer that can run Substance Painter very well. Maybe you don't have a graphics card or something else. Whatever the reason, if you can't use Substance Painter, we're going to bake our maps in XNormals and then work on them either in Photoshop or a different 2D painting or texturing piece of software. So let's get started. This is going to be our end result. I've done some extra work on the load toaster to give it some more details, and this is just the low poly with the texture maps applied. And specifically only the normal map applied. And I think the ambient occlusion as well. So I'm in Sketchfab here, and you can upload a low poly here and just add textures to it, see how they look. So this is how we're going to preview it. And let's just get into it, I suppose. We'll go to Maya, and you see a little preview of what we're going to actually get to. But let's look at our low poly and high poly just so you see what we have. I've brought them to the center of the world just by selecting both the low and the high and putting them in a group together. And before they were up here, and I just kind of move them to the center of the world. And they're actually like this. So I move this down to their center, and then I move them to the center with X, like that. I'm gonna just put them back so I don't break anything. So our low poly you saw before, and it's the same as before. Our high poly, I've added a lot of details. I've added these little things here, and these are just separate pieces of geometry just to essentially make it look a bit more like finger grips. And we have this here as well. I've added these, and we have these little thingies in here and all that stuff, right? So this is our high poly now, and I've exported both the high and the low poly, and I'm just gonna bake it, and I'm gonna show you what the result is. So let's do that in XNormals. So you open up XNormals, and if you just Google XNormals, XNormal, so the first one that comes up, and just select Windows 10, download, install, ready to go. Very quick. Old looking program, still gets updated, still very good for things like this. High definition, we want to take our toaster high and throw it in here. Low definition, toaster low, throw it in here. Then you go to baking options. You choose where you want to save it. I've put it on the desktop. That's where all our maps are going to go. And you just call them what you want them to be called. So I've clicked desktop, call them toaster. And it's going to fill up the rest of the name when it's actually making the maps. And you want you to save it as a TGA. These things usually you can leave by default. The only things that I change is I make sure the size is appropriate for what I'm making. So 1024 is completely fine for what I'm doing. And the edge padding is 2. Our anti-aliasing I've set to ×2, and this is reasonable. And the maps that I'm baking are a normal map and an ambient occlusion. And I'm also baking a bent normal map for a tutorial that I'll be making at a later date, which actually I can turn off for now. Then you can go to Tools after you've set your settings. And all you need to do now is do a ray distance calculation. And what this is going to do is it's going to essentially calculate the difference between your high poly and your low poly's UVs and decide what it's going to do when you start generating the maps. And this will come up, and you can just click go, and it's going to start calculating. And it will calculate until you click stop. I usually leave this for about 60 seconds, and you have a little counter here. I'm just going to leave it for 30 this time, so it's a bit quicker. If any errors show up for you during this time, check your mesh, make sure you have no n-gons. And if you still have some issues, just send me a message and we'll figure it out. And just 5 more seconds here. Stop. Copy results and close. Remember to copy your results. If you just click close without copying your results, nothing will happen. Now that all that's done, you can just click generate maps. I'm going to delete the textures I've made previously whilst testing all of this. just so they don't overlap. Right, so here our normal map comes up straight away, and I'm going to go to Sketchfab whilst the rest are, I'm going to hide our ambient occlusion for a moment. I'm going to come to Sketchfab and just reapply the normal map that we just created, even though the others are still getting made. So the normal map happened very quickly. And I'm just going to delete our normals that we have here, and I'm going to import the ones that were just made. Now, we have a few issues. You can tell that here we have a bit of, well, just glitches essentially, while the other side is fairly okay. Here we have some kind of line appearing on the toaster. And the first time I try this, and I do have this issue still, I have this stuff happening here. The back seems to be okay. So the reason these things happen is because we haven't told the program how far we want it to search for details. And people using Substance Painter will run into the same issue. Things that are very close together will essentially start projecting on each other. So the toaster's wall has decided to put this detail of the button on here because it thinks that it will always be there. The program has no way of knowing that this is something that will move. And even if it won't move, sometimes we just get this weird bleeding effect and essentially surfaces projecting on each other. Because we haven't told the program how far to search for details and when to stop searching for details, it will essentially expand the 3D model, the low poly, very far and start taking details that it doesn't need to. So what do we do in this situation to make sure that we don't get this issue? Well, let me go back to Maya and show you what I did to essentially fix this. So this is what we had before, this is what we exported, and I kept this, even though I needed to make some changes. I kept our original high poly and low poly because we want to have them. This is like our original high poly has all our details, and our original low poly is going to go in the game. But we need to fix those issues. So how do we do that? Well, I duplicated these, both of them. Oops, excuse me. I grabbed both of these, I duplicated them, and I grouped them. So I've already done that. And they're in here. And what I did was several things. First, I moved all these details outwards. So the high poly and the low poly both have these details moved away from the main body so they don't influence each other. And then I created a shrunk version of the low poly and a cage of the low poly, an expanded version, right? And what I'm doing with this is I'm telling the low poly to start here and scan for details until it gets here. So that way I know not only that it's not going to interfere with any of the others, but I also know that it's definitely going to get all of the details that I have in my high poly. And this is the same for toaster's body itself. Everything is together, of course. So I'm going to do this process again, just so you see how it's done. That is my phone, excuse me. Is it in here? Is it in there? Stefan, why don't you edit your videos? Why don't you take things like this out? Well, I'm trying to make all the videos go in a smooth run, so I need to do as little editing as possible. The less editing I need to do, the easier it is for me to make videos. And the easier it is for me to make videos, the faster I can, well, not the faster, but the more of them I can make for you. So I'm gonna leave this little thing in there. I don't even know if you could hear the phone, but my phone rang. That's what happened. Okay, so let's replicate this. Let's replicate this, creating a low poly that's shrunk and a low poly that expanded, and pulling these details out. So let's do that. I'm going to duplicate my low poly and my high poly. Just going to hide our originals. And I'm going to put them in a group and call this second example, just for you to see. And let's open them up like this. So first thing I want to do is move the details away. So I'm going to start with my low poly and grab these faces and just move them forwards. Doesn't have to be too far, it doesn't have to be as far as the ones I did before, but you need to move them forwards. Now let's grab our high poly, and because selecting all of these by hand is going to be a bit tricky, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select either one piece of each, or I'm just going to very crudely drag over this like that. Then I'm going to hold Control and right click and go to shell, and that's just going to immediately flood every isolated object. And I'm going to do the same for this other one as well. There we go. And that's not got anything else, I don't believe. And I'm going to match them. Now you can match them kind of roughly by eye, which is what I did with these, or you can kind of move your pivot point to a specific location that you know you can match up more accurately. But as you can see, these two are very different. So I'm just going to go by eye, which is okay to do sometimes. And next we need to do it for these things down here. Let's start with our low poly because it's a little easier. Move them out. And now let's go to our high poly. And for these ones, I definitely will kind of put my pivot point right in the center here and then pull them out like that. And I know that they're pretty much as on point. I moved them a bit by hand anyway. As on point as they need to be. Okay. So now we have our little segments separated, right? And remember, I still have my originals. I keep them separate. I need those originals for certain things as well. So I don't want to get rid of them. I don't want to just change them permanently. So those are still safe. This is called working non-destructively. You're keeping versions of your work so that you can go back and make changes if you need to. Now we have this now. And now we have to make sure we have a shrunk version and expanded version of our low poly so that essentially we can decide how much details to get. Let's duplicate our low poly and let's call this one shrunk, and let's call this one cage. And the shrunk, let's start with that one. Let's hide our cage. I want my high poly to be visible because I want to see whether I'm behind the details or not. And I'm going to select our shrunk here and go to vertices and select all the vertices. Then I'm going to go to modify, transform tools, move normal tool. This will create a new manipulator. One of the axes for the manipulator will be N for normal, and that's what we want to pull. If you pull it out, it's going to expand all the vertices towards their normal position, and if you pull it in, it's going to shrink them to their normal position. Be careful while shrinking. If you do it too much, you're going to get essentially, as you can see here and inside, you can get some errors occurring where things essentially start breaking and, as you can see here, imploding. So you don't need to go too far, just a little bit. Just make sure that instead of it being outwards, it's behind your high poly details like this. And this is enough. You can see it's behind it. Here as well, you can see that the low poly is behind all the details. Nothing is sticking through. If you want to make sure, just grab the low poly and see if there's anything poking, which there isn't. Okay, great. Let's do the same thing for a cage, but instead of shrinking them, we're expanding them. We're going to go to modify, transform tools, move normal tool, pull our N, and again, don't pull it too much because you're going to start getting pinching and erroring and stuff like this. You just need enough to envelop your high poly. And I think this is pretty much as I need. That might even be more than I need. Right? So your cage envelops your entire high poly, and your shrunk essentially shrinks into it. And what this is going to do, if we go transparent here for a moment, the highlighted one right now is my high poly, as you can see here. And I'm telling my low poly, first start from here and start reading for details until you get here. And then we won't have this weird little issue where things are essentially going too far and reading too far and giving us these weird issues. If you're wondering, but Stefan, you have already moved them further away from the body. Why would you need to create a cage? Well, I'm sorry if that sounded really pedantic. That was overacting there. But yes, I actually tried doing it without a cage. First I tried just moving these forwards and thinking, okay, they're far away from each other, and I just exported the low and the high, and I got even more errors because essentially it was trying to project this detail from far away onto the toaster still, and it was just misaligning even more. So this cage is a method that I actually use for everything now. Like, since I learned about cages, I use it for almost everything that I bake. You don't always need it, but I prefer to use it because I usually have a lot of high resolution details which I would like to capture. Okay, so enough talking. There'll be more talking, but enough talking about that. Let me show you the results. So this is the one I just did for you as an example, but this is the one that I actually exported. And I exported low and the high, the shrunk and the cage. So shrunk, cage, and a high poly, right? And you can see them on my desktop. I have toaster bake adjusted, I called it, for the low poly. This is the shrunk as well, the low poly. And I called toaster bake adjusted high. So the adjusted ones are the exact same as the normal ones we had, but these are the ones where I moved the buttons into space for the forwards. And we have our toaster bake adjusted cage, and this is the one we expanded. Now let's go back to XNormals, and let me just show you how you can apply a cage. Remove all of this, and let me delete these maps that we just made because they're not correct. So you put in your high poly, so go to high definition meshes and put in your adjusted high poly. And then you go to the low poly and you put in your adjusted low poly, which is our shrunk. Then you need to tick use cage. Then you right click, browse external cage file, and find the cage that you made. So toaster bake adjusted cage is what I've called it. And it will always remind you that the low poly and its cage must always be literally the exact same model. So it literally needs to be a duplicate of the model, but moved or expanded so that it covers all the areas you want to cover. That's what this warning is for. Our baking options are going to stay the same. I'm going to go to tools and again do a ray distance calculation. I don't really need to bake it again because I've already shown you kind of how it looks in Sketchfab, but I would like to just so you see how it comes up differently. And I'll actually only leave it for 20 seconds because I think that will be enough. 25. This is 25. Great. And just click generate maps and it's going to come up again and you can see there's no issues. You can see that the details come through even more strongly. And I can straight away go back to our Sketchfab here. And these issues will straight away go away. And take notice of kind of even just how this stuff looks right now. This is without a cage, without separating these. The details aren't coming through very well. Let's replace our normal map. Now you can see how much better the details are coming through because we've made sure that we're definitely going to cover all of them. And you can see here that we have absolutely no issues, apart from here. And that's something that I will need to adjust by hand to make sure that it's kind of not expanded too much in the wrong place or anything. But yeah, overall it's a much better result. Certain small issues like, oh, this is a little pixelated, this is quite pixelated, this looks a bit strange in here. Those are valid concerns. If you're making something that you see this close up, valid concerns. You need to fix that, you need to increase your resolution. For this, I'm gonna see it from here. I was wondering whether to go closer or further away, but I'm gonna see it from here. Nobody is gonna notice those things. Arguably, nobody's even gonna notice these details, and they're completely unnecessary. But I just left them in for you to see how certain details come through. And that's pretty much everything there is for texturing in Substance Painter. Wrong tutorial, excuse me. So that's pretty much everything there is for baking maps in XNormals. I guess the only other thing would be to show you how the ambient occlusion changes things. So the ambient occlusion essentially gives you shadows in areas that need them. And you can see, like, even though this is completely non-existent in the low poly and is entirely made from the normal map, shadows still appear there. So the ambient occlusion gives you some very interesting effects. Even on the back here on the plug socket, it gives the plug socket a shadow as if there's an inside. So it's quite when you see it from far away, if you're not like thinking about it too much, it definitely looks like there's details in there. So it's quite cool. And that's all there is. You export your files, you put them in a high and a low poly, you set your baking options, you make sure to do a ray distance calculation, and you bake your maps. If you're getting certain errors like this, you go back, you make adjustments to your model, separating pieces that need to be separated, and creating a cage and a shrunk version if you need to, and if you're still getting certain issues. Then you just go through the exact same process of importing in, your low and your high, just making sure that you tick use cage and then browse your external cage file that you want to apply to it. Again, you do your ray distance calculation and you generate your maps. And that's all there is for X normals. Thanks for tuning in.